Okay, welcome to this webinar on a gender-just trade policy in the EU-Mercosur agreement. And so I welcome you all. And first, I'm going to try to give you some instructions. First, I would like to tell you that we have a translation option in this webinar. We have interpretation from English to Spanish and Spanish to English. So you will find in the bottom of your Zoom screen to the right, a round symbol with interpretation written under it. You just need to click and then click on the language you want to listen to. So please also mute the original audio so you can hear only the translation of this language. Muting you can do with moving the button to the right under choice of language. Muy bienvenidos a todos a este webinario.
Welcome to you all to this webinar. First, before introducing the webinar and the panelists, I'd like to say that we have simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. To access the interpretation in the lower right-hand side of your Zoom screen, you will find a globe icon. You can click on that icon and select the language of your choice. If you wish, we also advise you to mute the original audio so that you only hear the interpretation. You can do this by clicking on the toggle next to the language button. If you're bilingual, you can keep your interpretation off. There will be 2 presentations in Spanish and 2 in English. So for those of you wishing to use the interpretation, I would ask you to please turn it on because I will be continuing in English.
So as I said before, you are very welcome. And on behalf of White and the Gender Trade Coalition, we are very thankful that you come to this webinar. And a good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. So White Plus is a European network of associations and activists that fights for women's rights as part of a larger struggle for social justice, sustainable livelihoods, and human rights. And one of our key advocacy priorities is to transform EU's trade policy. And for this, we are working together with the Gender Trade Coalition. This coalition is led by women's rights networks across the globe and supported by over 200 associations and experts in promoting a feminist alternative to the current trade agenda. So when we were preparing this webinar, we also collaborated with Seattle to Brussels, which is a network on development, environment, human rights, women, and farmers organizations, trade union, and social movements, as well as with research institutes that fight for a human rights-based EU trade policy. My name is Edme Dominguez. I'm an associate professor at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And I'm also a board member of GADIP, my organization in Sweden, Gender and Development in Practice, and of White Plus, the organizing network of this webinar. So I will chair this webinar on gender and trade regarding Mercosur and the EU. So before we start, I start introducing the topics. I would like also to tell you that if you want to ask questions after the speakers' contributions, we will have some time for that and for an interactive discussion. So you can use the chat section at the bottom of your panel. You can also use that if you want to share your work or make any other contribution. So unfortunately, you cannot ask questions via Facebook. So we are committed to a civilized feminist exchange and interaction. And as organizers, we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic or anti-feminist way. We will be live streaming this webinar and it will be made available afterwards, including any slides. If you want to remain anonymous while asking a question or comment, we suggest you rename yourself with anonymous or another pseudonym in the Zoom profile. Now I'm going to introduce the topic and the speakers. Regarding the topic, we can say that after 2 decades long negotiation, the European Commission concluded talks with Mercosur countries, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, into a deal that has been contested ever since by the European Parliament and by several of the parliaments of the EU member states. It has been planned for adoption in the first part of 2021, unless the Corona position keeps its position on protecting the environment and human rights above trade interests. So the EU-Mercosur agreement includes the common future of a European multilateral free trade agreement with elements that are expected to harm nature, farmers in different continents, and decent livelihoods for indigenous communities. It will have impacts on gender inequalities, which are not often discussed. And we hope that through this webinar, it will be reflected what a gender trade policy would entail for the EU-Mercosur agreement and where it falls short. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and afterwards to pass to the questions that will be part of this discussion. First, I would like to introduce Graciela Rodriguez, who works at the Institute EQUIT, the Institute for Gender, Economy, and Global Citizenship in Brazil, and is a member of the Gender Trade Coalition. She has monitored the trade negotiations from a women's rights perspective for the Mercosur region for a long time. She was the global coordinator of IGTN, International Gender and Trade Network, in the previous decade, and a member of the executive coordination of the Gender Working Group, or REBRIP, Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Then we have Bettina Müller, who works at the NGO Power Shift, which is a German non-governmental organization promoting a sustainable economic alternative through monitoring trade, raw materials, and climate policy. She's an associate researcher with the Transnational Institute, TNI, and is also a specialist on the trade and investment regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's part of the Seattle to Brussels, where she involved in the EU-wide campaign Rights for People, Rules for Corporations, Stop ISDS, and currently the campaign to stop the EU-Mercosur agreement from being concluded. Finally, we have Alma Espino, who is a researcher and professor at the Institute of Economics, University of the Republic in Uruguay. And since 2013, she's a president and member of CIEDUR, Board of Directors and coordinator of the Development and Gender area. Since 2003, she has been a professor in the Regional Training Program on Gender and Public Policy, RIGEP Flaxo. And since 2006, she has belonged to the Latin American Working Group on Gender, Macroeconomics, and International Economics. Dr. Espino has also worked as a consultant for governmental agencies and ministries in the countries and the region, as well as in international organizations like World Bank, UNRISD, IDB, ECLAC, UNDP, ILO, and several others. She's a member of the board of the International Association for Feminist Economics, IAFFE. So after this presentation, we are going to start with the questions today. And the first question is, could you tell us what are the impacts of this agreement on sustainability? And I address this particularly to Bettina, please.
Yes, hello. I will be speaking in English, so if you want me to change to Spanish, no problem. But as you asked me in English, I will just keep on talking in English. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the EU-Mercosur agreement, which, as you said, I have been working on for quite some years now, and which is really worrying us. So the more people find out about this agreement and about its varying effects for the EU and for Mercosur countries, the better. As for the impacts on sustainability, I will prepare four, and then maybe the others, I prepared four, or I will present four, and then maybe the other two speakers might want to add. But some of the things that we always highlight when it comes to the impact on sustainability is that on the one hand side, the agreement will lead to an increase in import quota. So there will be more products imported to the EU, products related to deforestation, products related to the massive use of pesticides, and to monocultures and cattle, and will also decrease tariffs for those products. So this might lead to further deforestation that we're already observing now, to further wildfires that are not only in Brazil a big problem, but also in the other countries, especially in Argentina and also Paraguay. To the expulsion of farmers and indigenous people from the lands, and so on and so forth. So that is a very clear impact this agreement will have on questions of sustainability. There's also an impact when we look at what will be exchanged. Actually, quite a lot of the products that are going to be traded, further traded, because in a way they are already traded, because there is already trade between the EU and Mercosur, are products that are already produced on both sides of the Atlantic in a sufficiently. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about apples, for example. So apples from Argentina, I'm not quite sure if you have that in other countries, but in Germany, where I am at the moment, the supermarkets are full with apples from Argentina. And you were wondering, why is that? Do we really need that? And that would be increased even with this agreement because of the loss of tariffs. It will also destroy industrial capacities, especially in the Mercosur countries, because the Mercosur countries will lower or even abolish their tariffs for things like cars and car parts, but also for other machinery, for textiles. So that will actually have a very negative effect on the industrial capacities in those countries, which is also why labor unions in the Mercosur countries are currently preparing a riot, if you want, against this agreement. There have been declarations published, and they're very worried. This also leads to the creation of a vicious circle that we already observe in the Mercosur countries anyway, that in order to import more manufactured goods that you cannot produce anymore in your countries, because through this agreement, your industrial capacities have been destroyed. So you need to expand even more monocultures. You need to even expand more the export of raw materials, which is exactly what this agreement fosters. And last but not least, it also endangers the livelihoods of EU farmers. Let me say also of Mercosur ones, but as I'm seated in a EU country, I also wanted to mention that. Because with certain products from Mercosur countries, like sugarcane, which is then which then becomes ethanol, for example, but also with meat, bovine meat, EU farmers cannot compete just because they're in the EU, they're produced on a very much lower scale. There's also other standards when it comes to environmental standards. So, which is why EU farmers are very concerned. And when we're looking at what the EU kind of proposed itself as commitments towards lowering CO2 emissions, really becoming neutral, CO2 neutral until 2050. If we're looking at the farm to fork strategy, that also talks about minimizing to a big extent the use of pesticides, then we have to say that all this is actually contradicted by the EU-Mercosur agreement. And what we would do is just, export the pesticides that we might not use anymore in the EU, but that is really not resolving the problem.
Okay, thank you, Bettina. Then we go to the next question. Could you highlight the negative impacts and possibly also positive impacts of the current EU-Mercosur agreement on sustainable development and women's rights? And then I would like both Alma and Graciela to give us their views. Thanks. So Graciela, would you like to start? You have to, your micro.
Sí. Bueno, hola, buenos
Hello.
días.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure meeting you all. Thanks for the invitation. Bettina, Alma, we've been colleagues for many years. I'd like to share warm greetings with all of you. It's a pleasure being here with you. And I'm speaking in Portuguese. I just realized I'll try speaking in Spanish. I sometimes forget. So I'm very happy to be with you today to discuss the EU-Mercosur agreement. It's an opportunity to share our positions and our criticism to this agreement with our European colleagues. Bettina already mentioned some of the negative impacts, and I can add on to these negative impacts. But I did want to start off by saying that we must all recall that this agreement, which has been negotiated for so many years, and we've been monitoring this since the end of the 90s when and the negotiations started in the Rio summit, and then in 2004 when it stopped, and then it was retaken in 2010. We've been following all of these negotiations, and this agreement accompanied the political cycles both in Europe as in Mercosur countries, and it also continued the WTO cycles and all of the ins and outs of the negotiations. Sometimes they were more favorable for the countries of the north in the WTO. Sometimes they were more favorable with taking regional or bilateral agreements. So this agreement has gone through many different stages. It's important that we recall that these negotiations, which and have not yet been fully concluded because there are some issues that they're still being discussed with regards to the legal form and legal aspect. And this opens the possibility to make some changes where that we know very little about. I'd also like to recall that this agreement was discussed behind closed doors and the last part in total secrecy. And we do not yet know everything we should know about this agreement. So there are many issues that we have to think about still when looking at the impact. I just wanted to recall two things. First, this agreement started off being a cooperation agreement, political agreement, and as with a part of it that was related to trade, but the cooperation and the democratization side of it were forgotten, and it remained as a simple free trade agreement. So this is a very serious thing per se, because the whole of the negotiations were kicked off with a completely different idea where there were other elements. There were elements of strengthening democracy and cooperate scientific and technological cooperation, etc., etc. There were other forms of cooperation that were included, but Mercosur was in fact created mirroring the European Union. The model adopted by Mercosur for regional integration took many of the elements of the European Union. So this agreement, which could have meant a huge stimulus for discussions and for learning lessons and to sharing exchanges and to consolidate democracy, was forgotten. And this is also a consequence of the neoliberalization process in the EU and the contradictions that grew in the European Union as well as in Mercosur. The second element I wanted to recall is that this agreement was signed, so as to say, as during a window of opportunity at a time where on both sides we had the main countries of Mercosur, Brazil and Argentina, but also in Uruguay, where we had an outgoing president. So the president was outgoing, although they didn't know whether he would re-win the elections. But in Argentina, we had an outgoing president who left after creating a total disaster in the country with regards to the situation, and he dismantled the state and a debt of billions of dollars. And we still do not know how the IMF approved such levels of debt. It's a dramatic, really dramatic situation in Argentina due to the government and the debt taken on by the government, Macri government. And then on Brazil, we have Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, but we must also say this very clearly for our European colleagues. Bolsonaro is not more or less complicated. He's not slightly authoritarian. No, we have had authoritarian governments many times. I mean, we know a lot about authoritarianism in Brazil. The difference with Bolsonaro is that there was a coup d'etat, and it hasn't necessarily suspended the formal processes of democracy. That is the secret behind this matter. I mean, we experienced a military coup d'etat with more than 11,000 military occupying executive posts, and it was done in a way that a new way of doing coup d'etat, differently from what was done for so long in Latin America. So that is the situation. So we shouldn't dress it up as a low intensity democratic government. No, it's a government that built a military coup using different mechanisms, the setting up of a candidate based on fake news, a whole series of processes with a huge support from the military and with a huge support from the Brazilian elite, which, and this is another element to think about, sometimes when we discuss a free trade agreement, we look at the clause. And I could talk of agriculture, services, e-commerce. This is another level of the disaster of the digital economy, and we can talk about it. And I'd like to talk about all this, but I also want to look at how the agreement was approved and at what time the agreement was approved, and the negative impact it has to do more with this than with just looking at the clauses in the agreement, which are also very serious in terms of the economic implications it can have. So we're at a time in the world where the European Union itself has to force its free trade agreements because the EU is also in a very fragile and weak position with regards to the US-China dispute. So the European Union itself is also in a very weak and problematic situation. And for the EU, having a free trade agreement can also be beneficiary in a situation where isn't being able to create its internal strengthening mechanism, because the neoliberal model applied to the EU has brought huge problems to democracy. Well, there's been a process of de-democratization, as Wendy Brown says, or processes where the social welfare state has been diluted, and we are seeing this breaking down in Europe. So this is the context where they are signing an agreement which has to do with the global hegemonic dispute and which is conditioning us enormously. This is also an agreement, and here I'm going into the matter. This is an agreement that promotes two problems that were previously existing, which have a lot to do with the elites in our countries. It's not just conditioned by the EU, but it has to do with the production model that this agreement wants to strengthen in Mercosur. Why? Because what we have right now, what we clearly see in this hegemonic dispute is that new colonial models or neo-colonialist models are being imposed. We are living a world where the international labor division is deepening again in the sense that it is looking at ways to place countries in the south in a situation where they have to produce new raw materials that our economy needs. Raw materials are still necessary, especially raw materials for export. And what is at play in this process is the use of land and territories, or extractivism in a more general term, but very especially minerals that are necessary for the 4.0 industry that is being implemented in countries in the north. So what we are seeing is that the neo-colonialization process is getting stronger, and our territories are again put in a situation where they were trying to escape from during decades with small industrialization processes, and Mercosur had also been a way of helping this process of industrialization with the automobile chains, which obviously could have been developed further. I mean, we must also bear this in mind. It's not just because of the EU-Mercosur agreement. The big importance of Mercosur is that it offers the possibility to have trade relationships in Mercosur of manufactured goods. And this is falling apart. And with the EU-Mercosur agreement, it will be completely killed because the industrial production, European industrial production has advantages that the industry in Mercosur won't be able to resist. There is a strong deindustrialization process in Mercosur countries in recent years. So this is all part of these discussions, and we could think of all of the implications it has for the population and for women. The fact that they are increasing extractivism and encroaching on territories. That is Bolsonaro's project. He says it very clearly. They have uh, the militias in the city that are also used in the Amazon to promote bushfires and the expropriation of land to increase the agricultural frontier, but especially for the extraction of minerals. They're trying to, I mean, with gold mining in the Amazon, the situation is dramatic. I won't go into details, but the expropriation of land and obviously this way of production is having huge impact. And to conclude with my answer to this first question, I'd like to say that one of the most negative impacts in this agreement is precisely the fragmentation or the weakening of the regional integration process. Mercosur is an agreement which until now is an agreement between countries which have a common external tariffs. They weren't able to expand it to a broader common market. Neoliberalism imposed itself in a time when they were trying to come up with a deeper process to increase the integration process. But there is no, in our countries,
globales, al
there's
proceso
no way
de
of joining the
globalización,
global
a los
processes,
mercados
the
globales,
globalization process
sin
and the
mediar
global market
un fuerte proceso de integración regional
without
de
a
nuestros
strong
países que les permita
regional
a la
integration process
grado
that
de
allows our countries
organización del
to
mercado interno y
organize
de
their domestic
industrialización para
market
ese
and to
mercado interno. La
industrialize
Federación
their
Mundial de CEPAL desde hace años
domestic
que ahora tendría
market. And
que
we're
ser en
going
base
back
a
to
otro tipo de
theory that now
industrialización que
we
pasa
should have
por
other
la
ways
industria
of
4.0, pasa por
industrialization with the
la inteligencia
4.0,
artificial, pasa por los
industrialization,
datos,
artificial
y
intelligence,
claro,
data.
pasa por los datos, que son la nueva materia prima,
Data, we
la
could say,
fuga de
the
esta
new
materia
raw
prima de esta
material
región, de
today
nuestra región.
will also be extracted
Entonces,
from
en
our
fin, creo
regions.
que
So
esto es
I
un
think
daño bastante
this
irreparable
is
que el
doing
proceso le
a
hace
lot of
a la región,
harm
¿eh? O sea, no
on
podemos
Mercosur.
salir a competir en un
We
mercado
can't
global
compete
con
in
los
a global
países
market
aisladamente. Y el proceso de
as
integración
countries
regional
in an
por lo
isolated
menos
way, and the
no
regional
pudo
integration
avanzar
process
más
wasn't
porque la
able to
disputa
go further
internacional justamente
because of
tiene ese papel
the
de
international
imponer la
dispute
división
has
internacional
a role of
de trabajo en nuestros países,
imposing an
tanto en América
international
Latina como
division of
en el
labor
mundo, ¿no?
in our
En fin,
countries, in Latin America and
entonces
in Africa.
son las áreas
So
de grande
these
peso,
are
digamos así,
the
de
biggest
Occidente, de Occidente que
weight, I think, that
y por
the
supuesto China también
Western
en este
world is
momento
imposing, and obviously China
creciendo y
too. China is
aprovechando también los
growing and
territorios de
is
África
using the
de
territories in
América
Africa
Latina y
and
esta
Latin
disputa
America,
estamos en el medio
and
como
we are caught
sándwich, ¿no?
trapped in the
Entonces,
middle of this
quería mencionar
dispute. So I
los
just wanted to
impactos
mention that
negativos son
the
muy
negative
altos,
impacts
no
are
solamente por el tema
huge and
comercial en sí,
different,
como
not
hemos
just
hablado
because of trade
claramente,
itself,
sí por los
but
cambios
also
en la
because of the
geopolítica, en lo que ha sido en lo que está
geopolitical
siendo el proceso
changes and in
de
the
desmonte de los estados nacionales,
process where nation states are
de
being
debilitamiento de los
dismantled,
estados
they're being
nacionales para
weakened
hacer política pública.
in terms of their capacity to have public policies. Thank you.
Yo quisiera invitar a Alma a contribuir también a esta pregunta.
Sí, claro.
Thank you, Priscilla. I would like to invite Alma.
Bueno, antes que nada, me gustaría saludar a todas y a todos los participantes.
So first and foremost, I would like to thank the participants and thank you for your invitation to communicate in these difficult times. This is a very important issue.
Creo que, no sé si soy yo o ustedes.
I don't know if it's me, but I think there's a background noises. I'm sorry, that was me. Sorry. I'll turn it off. Sorry, I wasn't too sure. So this topic is so important, is that gender relations, and I think this matter is so important because of this. These matters are interlinked with economic aspects and with political aspects as well. So it's important to ask ourselves how this can impact population as a whole, but also how it can affect women, and particularly women from the Mercosur region, which tend to be more fragile than women from the European Union region. I would also like to highlight that since the beginning of these negotiations 20 years ago, also with Graciela, with other comrades, we were talking with WIDE and we were analyzing the impacts, the gender and social impacts of this agreement. Like Graciela was saying, back then there were different characteristics. So there are different questions that one should ask oneself. I will focus on the question itself, and I will talk about its impact on sustainable development and women's rights, particularly on employment, and also particularly in the case of Uruguay. I would also refer to a recent article. People who will be most benefited by this are the sectors which are already benefiting. So industry from the EU side and agriculture on the Mercosur aspect. Graciela talked about the industry. We have manufactured goods, technological goods. Brazil might be most affected by this, actually. What's most attractive for the EU is the agricultural sector, which will benefit Argentina and Uruguay particularly. When we talk about development and employment, we see that this agreement does not promote diversification of production at a rate that it can promote foreign capitals. It can also deepen inequalities in the regions. Regarding exports, given the agreement, if we deepen on the productive and exporting aspect of this, this agreement does not contribute, for instance, in the case of Uruguay, does not contribute to increase employment. And it also doesn't help coming over restrictions in the working sector. Female employment is particularly affected by this, and this is important because it's one of the important elements in autonomy for women. So the distribution of men and women in the sectors and in several activities, which actually usually goes hand in hand with stereotypes, gender stereotypes, we see that there wouldn't barely be any changes. Some women might be benefited by this, but many others will lose their jobs due to the pressure of imports. So the capacity of women to increase their income or to keep their job will have an impact on gender equality. We're not seeing any benefits on this side, so we believe that this agreement will not contribute to promoting gender equality, empowerment, and economic autonomy of women, which is actually closely linked to physical and political autonomy. Like we said, the increase of industrial exports, particularly in the case of Uruguay, will lead to the destruction of employment, and it will not have an impact on female employment because women are not employed in this sector. So regarding employment, which is one of the most important issue for societies and for countries like Uruguay, particularly in this case, the pandemic has worsened several processes due to global value chains and with other issues. We see that we find ourselves again with high unemployment rates, and we don't know which will be the implications at a medium and long term. So in these conditions, this agreement, the EU-Mercosur agreement, in the case of Uruguay, will have a very low impact on employment. It won't have, in terms of quantities, it won't have an impact on female employment. It won't contribute to improving working conditions for women, and it won't contribute to gender equality. I think this is important to highlight. And even more, if we think about what's happening in the working markets and labor markets, there are different aspects. Like Graciela was saying, we have barely any information about what is happening in the labor market. So this is what I wanted to say about impacts on gender or on women.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
And now I'm going to continue with the next question. And it's also for Graciela and for Alma. What should be the alternative to the current agreement from a women's rights, a feminist perspective? That means another kind of agreement, no agreement. What do you think about that?
Para seguir, ya que
Well, I
estaba,
can continue because I was already talking about this. So I think about alternatives. I'll be brief. I think Graciela already covered this to a certain extent. So we find ourselves, we live in a world which had some characteristics of protectionism. There had been an increase of high companies, the current political and economic situation, which has been worsened by the pandemic. So I think what we have to do is we have to strengthen as much as we can. I understand this is very difficult because of the political situation in our country. So we should promote integration processes. There have been studies and there's been possibilities, and we know that this is what happened in the beginning of the Mercosur. We should diversify production. We should break with production patterns in Mercosur. This would promote, this would allow for better employment. This would allow to create better quality employment. We could benefit from new technologies, and we could provide better conditions for women in Uruguay and in Latin America, and also in the Mercosur region, have been recently having better educational levels and thus receiving better employment. And they're yet still being affected by hard conditions. It's really hard for them to access certain professional and political spheres. So if we could have trade collections and connections, and also economic and political connections, which could allow us to improve and overcome these barriers, this would have a great impact. Mercosur is very fragile. It's changed a lot. Every day we have these agreements, these meetings with presidents, and we've seen that there's little attention paid or little interest paid to reduce economic interests because of the situation in China, and there's little attention paid to Latin America. So this is what Graciela was saying. We should foster regional cooperation. This is what we need. Thank you, Alma. Graciela, would you like to add anything? I completely agree with what Alma said. I think she mentions very interesting elements. What she said about breaking employment patterns in Mercosur. I think we're all talking about the same thing, always about the same thing. We're talking about breaking, actually we're talking about breaking with free trade. Free trade cannot happen if we want to talk about sustainability and development. Free trade is not compatible with sustainability and development. And this has happened since the very beginning, when England imposes free trade on France and Germany. They actually said, after a year, we don't want this anymore. We see this is been the same ever since. And we also have to take into consideration colonialism, which is the base, the foundation of these territories in the South. So the solution maybe would be to decolonize the world. I think this should start in Europe, from Europe, with Europe. We can't just do it with the North if our relationships in, at least in the West, we also see the US-EU relations nearing some sort of colonialism. These processes are very difficult and they're very dangerous. The EU could go back into war, really. The US, once again, Joe Biden might be more educated and he might be better than Trump in his manners, but he is the man of war. He supports the industrial military American system. The US, in its relations with Ukraine and everything else, we see that nothing is changing there. So we can't talk about alternatives here. We're talking about survival. This is our alternative now. We have to survive. I completely touched by a colleague who died. She was very important in the Brazilian feminist movement. Dani Silva from Belo Mundo. She was very important in the struggle against the Belo Monte dams after fighting against COVID for a month. She passed away. Just to give you an idea of what was happening, she was getting better in the beginning. And then there were electric cuts, there were light cuts in Altamira. Altamira is nearby the largest dam in Brazil. And she was one of the female leaders fighting against that dam in that territory because it destroyed the territory. There are many white, also indigenous peoples living there, and the dam wasn't able to guarantee electricity in the city. Our colleague was without a ventilator for hours and hours due to these power cuts. It was afterwards, once the light went back on, it was very, very difficult for him, for our colleague to recover. So we're talking about survival now, and survival is very difficult. This is where we find ourselves at. So I cannot think about alternatives in a process of this size. We have to fight together against this agreement in a macro dimension. We have to think about recolonizing territories. We're paying high price. And I'm talking about populations who live in these territories. Nature is being destroyed. We only talk about the destruction of nature, but not only nature is affected by this, also people and their livelihoods, people who depend on the rivers, and people who live in production areas in the Amazon. The Amazon is not an empty place, it's a place full of people. Many people live there. These people are keeping nature alive. Of course, also in other regions, in El Chaco, in Paraguay. Paraguay is also being destroyed. So This is a very deep process. And women are part of the very important leadership who is fighting against these models. Many of the leaders in Brazil of the leaders who are fighting against all of this are women, white, Black, Indigenous peoples. Many of them are women, and they're leading this the fight against this model. And our thoughts are also being colonized. So in summing up, we live in very difficult times, very complex, and we've lost respect with reality because we're so far away from it. We receive so many lies every day. We find ourselves in a very difficult situation. And I think the alternatives need to go through Europe. Europe is a very important resisting space, a space which resists for human rights. If you cannot guarantee them, if you cannot make them stand, it's very, very difficult otherwise. I don't want to put more pressure on you. I'm just saying that we have to do this together. It's very difficult, and I'm very touched by everything that we've been living.
So we go to the next questions, and these are going to be for Bettina. And this is, where does the agreement currently stand, and what can we expect at the political level concerning the ratification? But I want to put as well the other question, which is that some political or the stakeholders in different Mercosur countries have argued that despite unfavorable conditions in the EU-Mercosur agreement, it is necessary to sign and go ahead with the agreement as a counterforce to the unbalanced trade relations with the US and China that create also unfavorable dependencies for Mercosur. So what do you think, Bettina? And perhaps also some of you can also have your views. Bettina, please.
Yeah, thank you. Graciela, ¿me apagas tú? Ay, gracias. Thank you, yeah. Sorry, I was hearing the background of Graciela's, what was passing there. I was still thinking about what Graciela said about the alternatives and that they have to go through, or that they also have to come from Europe. Yeah, I think you're completely right. Only that it's a bit difficult here to talk with our political decision makers about alternatives, because all the time when we come with a bit more radical alternatives, which for me, they're still not at all radical enough, then, you know, it's like they slam the door in your face, basically. And let's not even start about the human rights situation in Europe and then the fronteras. I should have talked in Spanish, maybe, of Europe. So yeah. But as for your questions, so where are we at with the EU-Mercosur agreement? Is there still a chance to stop it? Yes, there is. That's the good news. As Graciela, I think, already said, there is, let's say, there was a political agreement signed in June 2019. And the political decision makers and the negotiators, they said, so now it goes to legal scrubbing, which is a process where it's like a legal review of the document, of the agreement. And then by 2020, so last year, we'll pass it on to the EU Council. That's for the process in the EU, right? The EU Council is the first one, so the member states, 27 member states, the governments, are the first ones to decide if they accept the agreement as it stands or not, after legal scrubbing and after translation. So we're now in April 2021. There is still no final document because there are still quite some debates when it comes to geographical indication and so on and so forth. As far as we are informed, legal scrubbing and the negotiations in some parts are still ongoing, as are the translations of the document to the more than 20 EU languages. currently, they started also a process of consultations between the EU Commission and the EU member states. Why is that? Because the agreement received so much negative attention and so much criticism also from EU member states, namely from France, from Austria, from Belgium, from the Netherlands. Even Germany, the German chancellor said the way it stands, she would not sign the agreement, which is quite a lot for Angela Merkel, let me say that. And so they started, the EU Commission, under the current EU Trade Commissionary, Valdis Dombrovskis, they started a consultation process to prepare an additional document, which can take different forms, to enforce certain dispositions of the agreement. What are those? Specifically the one on deforestation, on indigenous people in a way, and on climate change. So what they want is to have really some commitments from the Mercosur member states saying, yes, we are going to implement fully the Paris Climate Agreement, and yes, we're going to halt deforestation in our forests. Not only the Amazon, but the Amazon has been, of course, of great concern to our political decision makers. Not other things, though, that were all mentioned by Alma and Graciela. They are not very concerned neither of the potential job losses or the worsened conditions, labor conditions, nor the imbalances that are created by the agreement and so on. That is none of this is really of concern to them, but yes, the Amazon, which is concerning, let's say, but that is not going to be addressed by this additional document. So these consultations are still ongoing, and once they are finished, then the EU Commission starts negotiations about this additional documents with the Mercosur countries, especially with Brazil. Now, where does that leave us? That leaves us with still not knowing when we'll have a final text, still not knowing when the Council, the EU Council, will decide on the agreement, which also then, once it is decided by the EU Council, that of course also starts a process in the Mercosur countries, a process of ratification, right? And we still do not even know when those additional documents will be presented, the way they will look like, and so on and so forth, because, as Graciela said, this is a completely intransparent process where no civil society whatsoever has been involved. And it seems like that we'll still have to wait a bit. Apparently, the EU Commission is probably waiting out for the French elections to happen, which is May 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And they're even talking about waiting out the Brazilian elections, which would be end of next year. So then they would have another leader a bit more presentable to the EU member states and also to the EU public. Nevertheless, there is, there's still some movement around this agreement, and later on, I remember that we will talk also about what we can do and what we're actually already doing as civil society organizations. As for your second question, and I will answer that very quickly and briefly, I imagine that Alma and Graciela will have to say quite a lot about the involvement, the economic involvement of China, in the US in their continent. But we're very often presented with that argument, actually, when we're talking to our political decision makers here in the EU. So what we are answering them when they're saying, yeah, but we need this agreement because of the geopolitical situation, because China is taking over, because we're losing out, and so on and so forth, is that, first of all, this is a very hypocritical argument. Why? Because the EU is still today the second largest trading partner of the Mercosur countries. And just until some years ago, it was actually the biggest trading partner of the Mercosur countries. Has that changed anything about the situation, about the imbalances, about the unfavorable dependencies of the Mercosur countries, it hasn't. So really, when we're now saying we need this agreement to tackle the Chinese presence in Mercosur countries, really, what is this going to change? Because we know from history that really this has always been the case. There have always been unfavorable dependencies for the Mercosur countries towards the EU. And this agreement is only set to deepen those imbalances and those dependencies. So really, it is rather because of such an FTA, because of such a free trade agreement, that the imbalances and the current situation that has been described already will worsen. And also it is because of the way the current world trade system functions. So I'm very much with Alma and Graciela when we talk about alternatives, and those alternatives really have to tackle the root causes of the worldwide imbalances, and FTAs only worsen them.
Thank you, Bettina. And I would ask Alma and Graciela if you want to add something here. Alma?
No, yo creo que
No.
ha sido muy completa la intervención.
I think your intervention was very complete. I'd just like to add that if we envisage that the agreement will be made effective, we don't know obviously, but let's assume it is, well then it would be extremely important to have a much greater participation of civil society. I think in the case of Uruguay, civil society hasn't been present in this process for several reasons. A, because we lacked information. B, because free trade, global trade was deteriorated, and all of the mobilization around global trade had come to a standstill because the government that was leading the negotiations for Uruguay was a left-wing progressive government that had the support of broad sectors of civil society, of workers, etc. So civil society wasn't in the discussion. Only a few specific organizations have always dealt with these topics. So I perhaps we do have an opportunity right now to step in and say, everyone says that global trade will be the engine to get out of the situation we're going through now. So I understand that this discussion is yet to come. So I think it would be very important to fight this and to try and have a say. That's all I'd have to add. Graciela? Yes, very important. I think we have to have a say, just as we did in the WTO negotiations, and we need a greater engagement of civil society. We need to raise awareness on the issues. I think it's very important here and also in the European Union itself, because perhaps this very same argument that you were saying they were saying it would be a counterpower to the growing influence of China and the US, which I mean here the hegemonic power is still the US in all aspects, culturally, economically, it's a hegemonic power, even if China is growing. We could also, the situation could also be, see, I think the discussions you're having and the need to discuss with China, Russia, and other countries in the EU to rebalance the US dominance and the NATO and the US military bases in European countries. I think these are all issues that could be used to re-engage civil society. It would be important to raise awareness and to foster discussion on this in the European Union. In the case of Latin America, we, for instance, right, recently Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Ecuador signed agreements with Chile. And our greatest concern with this free trade agreement with Chile, which covers the same issues and that is very serious concerns in terms of public and financial services, which have a deep impact on women, the issue of intellectual property, all of the implications of intellectual property trade and the importance it has for the vaccine that has dramatic impact on the world. They talk about global governance, but you cannot find a solution for a simple vaccine in the world. We're not talking about, how can we talk of global governance? We're talking of a vaccine and they haven't been able to make any progress in finding a solution. So, I mean, there are several topics. And what is very concerning also in this free trade agreement side with Chile is e-commerce. It's much more than e-commerce, of course. It has to do with the digital economy, data mining, data production. All of these issues are very concerning for us, and they have to do with technology, which could be a topic for coming up with alternatives, could be technology transfers. I mean, they're envisaging it'll further widen the gap in the gaps in the world. Anyway, all of these topic themes that are in the EU-Mercosur agreement are also in the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and the agreement with Chile could be a strategy for our region to enter into the TTP. 20 years ago, we were strong and we mobilized against the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It led to a very interesting process in our countries, which has to do with this mobilization against the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think we are now in a we're much more disorganized when it comes to fighting against entering the TPP. That is why I think Alma is right. We must think about this issue and how in America and in Europe we need to be where we know why, but we need to train people on e-commerce because it was 20 years ago when we were in the discussion with the area of free commerce of the Americas, and that is where the coalition of trade and gender emerged and had people around the world in many countries in Latin America and South Asia, even in China, we have some sisters who were able to articulate a discussion in Kazakhstan, in several countries that we would have thought it would be impossible to reach out into these countries. And I think we need to re-engage and come up with processes that can increase the discussion on this in amongst feminists and other sectors of civil society. Thank you so much, Bettina. That is what we want to do in WIDE, to revisit all of these topics.
And now there's another question also for Graciela and Alma, and that was that there has been a limited attention to in the negotiations and also the political discussions regarding gender implications. And that means both in the case of the European Union and in the case of Mercosur. What do you think? Why do you think this is the case? Gender has not attracted any kind of discussion. Por favor, Alma and Graciela. Tal vez empiezas tú, Graciela, de una vez.
Would you like to start, Graciela or Alma? Alma first? Okay. Well, I think on the one hand, I mean, it's what we were talking about before. Little attention was paid to many things, and including those many things as gender issues. On the other hand, I think these are topics that sometimes for the women's movements, the region has been heavily involved in other struggles, and maybe for the feminist movement, it's slightly difficult to come to understand these aspects which are seen far from the daily reality or technical. And this is a difficulty that those of us who have worked in global trade and economics have always faced. In some cases, we managed to overcome this through training capacity, training courses. And I could say that among young feminists in Argentina and in Uruguay, those I know, they really have been showing a great interest in the economy and linking it to the more traditional struggles of feminists and women. But there have been difficulties. On the side of the governments, we've always had very rebellious women's organization in all of the countries. We and government offices sometimes they're stronger now. It would seem that the gender issues in Argentina is gaining strength, but and in Uruguay, right now, with our current government, it's the Women's Institute that has no say whatsoever. We can't expect much from it. I mean, from the government bodies, we can't in generally expect much. And perhaps referring to Uruguay, the situation may be slightly different with regards to the trade union movement. I think a lot has been done with regards to gender issues in unions. We have the chair of the workers union here, who is more than an ally of ours. We've advanced progress in many aspects, and there, I think we can find women who are more interested in these aspects, and maybe there would be greater interest. But I think what happened has come because of all these factors I've mentioned, in my opinion.
Graciela.
Thank you, Alma. Graciela.
I agree with Alma. It's just the situation here is slightly or much worse. From the governments, we don't have actually any discussion with the governments. They've closed off every channel, and the only few discussions that we've had have been very manipulated. Government mechanisms are promoting anti-gender policies. They're going against gender ideology, and for instance, the Secretary for Women had a very interesting level, a very high level in Brazil, and they're now interrupting every program. So basically, they want women, they're promoting policies for women to go back to the homes. And we've seen this in Brazil's positions at an international level and their alliances with more conservative, let's say, countries, the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, for instance. So in foreign policy, it's been quite a disaster. So from the institutional side of things, we've been very bad. From the social movement perspective, I think we're in a bit of a complicated process. It's like what Alma is saying. We see that progressive processes managed to have quite a bit of an importance in public policy and in how we were moving forward in public policy discussions. However, this was back then, and this allowed to see that despite the fact that there was some opposition to the neoliberal movement and ideologies, they started forgetting that neoliberalism was widening at an international level, and they've also forgetting about the de-democratization process, like I mentioned earlier. So social, or let's say leftist civil society movements have lost a bit of focus, and they've stopped keeping track of this neoliberal movement. So they're in a very fragile state, to a point that even when in the US people were arguing whether Trump was neo-fascist or neoliberalist or what he was, they were trying to label him, and we see that we're in a similar situation. The feminist movement has lots of strength. They've been mobilizing from very early on, but at the same time, it's quite weakened by the general situation of social movements in the region, and particularly in Brazil. So it's very difficult to go back to what once was. The political discussion has not helped. In Brazil, particularly, we have what from the leftist circles, they talk about identitarianism. So social movements are defined as something that depends on identity and therefore shouldn't be prioritized. There is a lack of attention and depth in new feminist discussions. We have a book about these discussions. We wanted to deepen this discussion because we need to have new discussions. The feminist movement has talked about women's role in the class struggles and all of these very important issues, and how the labor market or the labor sector has changed, how elites have changed, how classes have changed. Elites are not what they used to be. Now they're completely linked to global value chains, social change. Social classes also changed. So we need to restructurize and see how new social classes, which are in a precarious situation, how these classes can find new ways to influence. So if we say the EU-Mercosur agreement will have a negative impact on employment, it won't create employment, and it would also actually make employment lose quality, then all of this will continue. We need new sectors. We need that new sector of precarious workers. Have them learn how this affects them. This is very difficult, but we need to do it. It will take some time, but I think it's important. And we need to inform political discussions and in general information.
So we go to the last question, and I think all of you could try to answer. And that is, could you put, Graciela, the noise? Si puedes, si puedes cerrar. Sí. Sí, what can individuals and associations do in the coming months or years to resist the current agreement and support alternatives? Could you also reflect on your work and what is effective or less effective? So it's a question for all of you. Perhaps we can start with Bettina. In this question, what can we do?
Yeah, thank you very much. Fortunately, there's a lot of things we can do.
Estamos haciendo, Bettina. ¿Qué estamos haciendo?
Exactly.
We've been doing lots of things.
We're already doing quite a lot. And also at a transatlantic level, if you want. And I'm not referring to transatlantic US, EU, but South America, especially Mercosur and EU. So because that's also transatlantic, people tend to forget that. We just launched a transatlantic coalition, which is called Stop EU-Mercosur, which was signed, the declaration was signed by more than 450 organizations from civil society. So you have social movements, you have labor unions, you have environmental organizations, but also feminist groups, for example. And even before that, we were coordinating and organizing activities. We're trying to, I'm saying, as I'm involved in the S2B network, which is a Seattle to Brussels network, is a EU-wide network of organizations that work on trade and investment. So together we have been organizing different activities. We're always trying to get more information by talking to our to our political decision makers, to the EU Commission. We used to organize strategy meetings in person. Now it's all virtual, and also days of action, also not just virtual. In fact, there is going to be a day of action on the 20th of May, because as I'm not sure if I mentioned that, it's the EU Council meeting of the trade ministers. And around this day, the 20th of May, we're organizing different activities in all the EU countries that want to join in. So far, there's Germany, there's Belgium, there's Portugal, there's France, there's Austria, and so on and so forth. And there's going to be decentralized activities in general because of COVID-19. This is smaller activities. In Brussels, for example, there's going to be one where there are 50 people allowed. So it's also a question of, maybe we could even mobilize more, but we're not allowed more. Which is one of the problems that we're facing actually when it comes to mobilizing against this agreement at the moment. And also to getting more information, because since the beginning of the pandemic, information has been even more difficult to get than before. So if you're interested in doing something about this agreement, I would suggest, not quite sure if you organize an organization or something, that your organization joins that coalition. We have general calls always in the afternoon European time, and every 2 weeks maybe, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, depending on the activities that we're organizing. There we already prepared a lot of material that if you're interested in more information we can share, not so much on the gender aspect, of the agreement, but on its general aspect also in different languages. You actually find that. I will post, there's a website of the coalition where you can find a lot of material, probably even in your language, because in many languages material has been produced so far. So yeah, I just invite you
Could
to.
you post it in the chat?
Yes, I will post that
links?
after I finish talking, because if I try to do both, that
Yes,
might lead to
of course.
problems. So yeah, just to invite you to join this coalition, to get informed, to even if you're if you want to prepare something for the 20th of, or around the 20th of May, to let our trade ministers, the EU trade ministers, know that we're completely against this agreement, because it's most likely they will talk this day about the agreement and about the next steps. So yeah, these kind of things so far have worked quite well, but you know, they would even work better if we could mobilize more people and if we could be more present in the public. But because of COVID-19, this is a bit difficult currently. And one thing I want to mention that has also worked very well is the fact that we created a wider network. The wider the network, the more people join, the more organizations join, the better. And the more organizations from different sectors, let's say, so labor unions, farmers unions, and so on and so forth, because that really creates a strong effect when it comes to talking with political decision makers. And different, you know, from different parties, because as the Social Democrats are more likely to listen to labor unions, it's good you have them in your team. Then you have the Christian Democrats, they're more likely to maybe listen to farmers, so the conservatives. So it's good if you have them in your team. So that kind of really worked well for us.
Yes, please publish all the information in the chat so people can access. Alma and Graciela. Yes.
Entonces, sí, nosotros también aquí estamos haciendo.
Yes, we've also been mobilizing over here. We are having some actions with European groups. This week, we met with Brazilian members of parliament. We're trying to mobilize them as well, because they're not thinking about these issues. We talked a bit about the EU-Mercosur agreement, also about the Brazil-Chile agreement, and we're trying to also coordinate with social movements. We have done quite a bit of work. They had already started. They've been doing that. They've been mobilizing since 2018-19, mobilizing particularly against Bolsonaro and his campaign and everything his campaign meant for indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples were already mobilizing quite actively, and we've managed to widen our contacts with indigenous peoples, and particularly indigenous women. They are much more aware than white societies, I might say, in Brazil. So we have been articulating with them. Articulating around Mercosur is very, very difficult. Our articulation really fell through, but we have been active with a group, a new group with different Latin American countries and Caribbean countries. In that platform, we have a specific group which works on EU-Mercosur agreement. We've also talked about free trade in this platform. This platform is called Simultaneous. So we are articulating in different spheres in Brazil. Our network is called REBRIP, Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples. We talk about regional integration, and also Mercosur. And our network is very active. It's receiving a lot of attention, particularly over the last year and in the last few months. We've been doing a lot of activities, and we coordinate the gender group in Rebrief. From the gender and trade network, we've been trying to keep active and follow the discussions, and we're trying to articulate through the Gender Trade Coalition, and we're trying to get back into the international sphere. And knowing that other people are very active on this is very interesting for us, because it encourages us to go back to thinking about how we can influence and impact coalition between European and American civil society. Could you share your links, please, for on the chat? I mean, for the audience. Alma? I think what Graciela mentioned was enough. We are running out of time, so maybe we can move on to questions from the audience. I have nothing else to add.
Then we can proceed to the questions, some of the questions. And there were already, yes, there was a question regarding Graciela can share some of her work as well, and to give the links to this work that you have mentioned. So there's another, also to Graciela. ¿Lo puedes leer tú, Graciela? De que,
Graciela, can you read the question? They are congratulating you on your work, and the question is, geopolitics are being disputed between China, Russia, and the US. How have public policies impacted women and indigenous peoples? And more specifically in Belgium, what can civil society do? There's another question about feminism. Yes, there's a question on ecofeminism and the issues that are affecting women. We can start off answering those two questions if you like. Okay, so I've already included the site of America Latina. I don't know, maybe while I speak, if someone could add the link, otherwise I'll be too distracted to do two things at one time. I'm not seeing the questions. I don't know where to look for them. There was a question about indigenous peoples and women and the geopolitics. Well, as I was saying, the situation of indigenous peoples in Brazil is dramatic, very, very serious, because the expanding the agricultural and mineral frontier in Brazil is being encroaching into the lands of indigenous peoples. Brazil has there was a negotiation many years ago that was reaffirmed in the 1988 Constitution, and that is that with regards to the determination of indigenous land, this means there is a huge amount of indigenous peoples that have clear limited land. Some are in the process of being limited or defined, but most do have their defined lines. And in many cases, when it comes to delimiting these territories, there's a certain dispute, but there are a lot of delimited lands in Brazil. The Brazilian territory, especially in the Amazon, also in other biomes, but especially in the Amazon, holds 13% of Brazilian territory, which must be the size of several European states, let's say. So it's a lot of delimited land, and the Amazon is largely protected. Protected in the sense that they are delimited indigenous lands that have protected the Amazon. There is a process which goes back a long time of occupying, illegally occupying these indigenous lands. It's illegal, but nevertheless, there is a lot of illegal occupation of these territories, and the battle is completely unequal and loyal. Normally, you have people called grileiros who occupy the land. They settle around the limit of indigenous lands, and indigenous peoples gradually move in to their land. This has happened in many places. There are even places where some indigenous peoples that have never had contact with society, with a colonized society, and there's a big problem in this regard. And then there is an organization within the government. There is a government body to deal with these issues. And this body, this government body, has been totally dismantled by the Bolsonaro government, which very few days ago they started a discussion with the US Embassy to discuss climate agreements to see whether the issues of indigenous people could be raised. And the Brazilian government took indigenous peoples that had been bought out by the mining companies. They are indigenous people who don't want to be indigenous. I mean, they are out of their villages, and I mean, it's a very big problem, and I would find it difficult to summarize it, but I would say there is strong mobilization of indigenous peoples, women, girls, with very diverse cultures, with very different and diverse languages, with very rural experiences, and they are growing stronger also in the Brazilian political stage. So this is very important, and this came from 2019. The EU visited Brazil on the occasion of the EU-Mercosur agreement. It was a very important um, visit, and it was good because it was enabled to different social movements to get to know each other. And the indigenous movement here is very strongly organized against this agreement. The organization is APIB, the Articulation of Brazilian Indigenous Peoples, and the acronym is in Brazilian, APIB, and you will be able to find their website if you want to find out more. I mean, the problem is very serious. The indigenous people have their own ways of living that are endangered. They speak more than 100 different languages, and the biodiversity that is also threatened by these agreements, and the extension of the agrarian frontier on encroaching in indigenous lands. I also want to say the other part of the question, what can civil society do? Well, Bettina already answered this question with all of the actions. We can also participate in organizations like us, like White Plus and other European organizations that are leading these struggles. Alma, would you like to add anything, and also to the question on ecofeminism?
No, no, eso por ahora no tendría
No,
más que
for the time
agregar.
being, I wouldn't have anything
Ese
else to add.
ecofeminismo
On
recién en mi
ecofeminism,
organización en
in
CIEDU
our
tenemos
organization,
algunas
Tirul, we're
trabajamos con
starting to
parte de
work
algunos
on
colegas
ecofeminism. We have some colleagues
en la cuestión del
who
cambio
are
climático
working also on issues
y en
such as
otros
climate change
asuntos, pero
and
son
other
esfuerzos,
matters. But
la verdad es que eso no tiene para
to be
mí.
honest, I don't
Y
have
además,
much to
si me
contribute
permite,
about
tengo que
ecofeminism. And I also
tengo
like
que
to say that
despedir
unfortunately I have
domicilio
to
porque tengo,
leave the
si me
webinar
permite, que
because in a
salir a
short
una
time
consulta
I
médica
have to
y
go to a
bueno,
medical
ha
appointment.
sido un placer.
But in any
Me
case, it's
disculpo
been
si
a
estoy un
pleasure. I
poco aburrida,
apologize
pero
for
ha
leaving
sido
slightly
muy
earlier,
enriquecedor.
but
Muchas
this
gracias a todos.
conversation has
Muchas
been
gracias,
very
Alma,
enriching.
y esperamos
Thank
verte
you
otra vez
so
en
much, Alma. We hope to see you
Gracias,
soon.
Alma.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Pleasure seeing you, Alma, says Graciela.
Aprovecho para hablar un
I'd like
poquito del
to
ecofeminismo que Alma decía.
take the
Nosotros
opportunity
también
to
aquí hemos hecho
talk about
algunos
ecofeminism. We
avances,
here in
sobre
Brazil,
todo
we
porque
have also
en realidad desde la
started
ECO
looking at this. I
92
mean, from
venimos
the
discutiendo
1992, we'd
levemente ese
been
tema. Fue importante
discussing
para la
this.
impulsación de la ECO 92
It
poder
was important for
levantar
ECO
la temática
92
del
when
cambio climático y todas las
the issues of climate change
problemáticas
first
ambientales.
emerged and environmental
Entonces,
issues
desde
in
ese
Brazil.
entonces vinimos
Since
tratando de
then,
hacer un poco
we
ese
have been
acompañamiento al tema.
trying to
Hemos hecho algunas
follow
publicaciones,
ecofeminism.
no,
We have had
nuestro,
some
lamentablemente no
publications.
podemos dedicarnos
Unfortunately,
más como nos
we
gustaría,
can't dedicate
pero
as
esto es
much
muy
time as we would
importante
like to
y puedo
ecofeminism, but
mandar
it's
un artículo
very important. And I can send you
del
the
artículo
link to an
que
article if you
hicimos para
like.
el Río más 20.
We wrote an
El
article
tema
for
tuvo
Rio Plus 20 where
un peso mayor, mucho
ecofeminism
debate durante la realización.
generated a big
Nosotros lo
discussion.
organizamos.
We
Nuestra
organized,
organización fue una de las dos
our
organizaciones
organization was
que
one of the
organizaron el territorio de las
organizers
mujeres
of the
en
women's
el
territory
Río más 20
in
en
Rio Plus
2012.
20 in 2012.
Y ahora hay una cierta discusión sobre la Río
And
más
now there's
30 para
some
el año que viene.
discussion on
Estamos
Rio Plus
débiles
30
todavía, pero
for next
puede
year.
ser que
It's still
tengamos
quite weak, but
una
we
inserción en ese
may
proceso.
be able
Entonces, bueno,
to
tenemos algunos
participate
materiales
in
y
that
algún
process.
trabajo
We have some
que tratar de
materials
poner
and
aquí.
some work.
Ahí
I'll
incluye
try
el video que hicimos sobre el
including
Río
the
más
link to the video that
20
we recorded for
y el
Rio Plus
artículo
20
que
and also sharing the link for the
en fin, es
article
interesante
on
para
ecofeminism that you may find
colaborar en ese
interesting,
debate, aunque sea poco.
even if, as I said, we haven't done a lot of work on ecofeminism. I was going to ask you precisely if you could share the link to the article and to the video you just mentioned.
Lo busco.
I'll look for it and post it in the chat. Great. Thank you, Graciela.
I don't see any more questions. I think that we have answered the ones that were put in questions and answers, and the comments as well from the chat. We have a few minutes left. Do you have any other questions or comments to our two panelists that are left? Anybody? Okay, I don't see any more questions arising. So I think that we have to round up and to thank very much our panelists for being here and for having answered all this dialogue that is so important for this discussion we are taking up today. Bettina has given us a very good overview of what is happening in Europe regarding this treaty and also the efforts of resistance against this treaty, which are very good. So for some of you who want to involve in this, we encourage to follow these links and to join into these struggles. I think that our organizations, especially I can speak for White Plus, we are going to follow very closely this, and we are going to try also to make more exchanges of information with the people working on these issues in Mercosur. That's one of our ambitions as well. And from the part of Graciela and Alma, we have got an enormous input regarding the perspectives of these issues from the part of Mercosur, from Uruguay, and the part from Brazil. But I think they gave us a very good overview of what is happening there and what are the interests from different parts, and also what is at stake in this discussion, and what are the interests behind all these agreements, and what are the possible consequences that we are already seeing today, but going to be much deeper in the near future, especially if this agreement goes into realization. So I think this has given us a very broad view, and also new questions, new issues, new challenges that we have to follow very closely. All of you who are interested on these problems, either from Europe or from Mercosur, from South America. And also now you have the key people who are working on this, and we hope really to keep in touch with them. Now I have seen that Graciela and Gea have put the links, and also we are going to have this webinar, the recording of this webinar, and all the resources in our page in White Plus. I didn't mention it before, but the person behind the practical organization of this webinar is Gea Majors, who is also with us. And Gea is our general coordinator now at White Plus. So it's really very much thanks to her and her team that we have been able to organize this webinar. So, and this is only the first. I hope there will be more webinars on these issues, on other trade agreements as well from the European Union. And we will follow that also presently with other kinds of webinars. I myself am engaged with the European Union agreement with Mexico, which has a lot to say about as well. So yes, so I think that we round up and we finish. Yeah, what do you say?
Yes, I mean, it's really excellent, and I think really a lot of food for thought, and I think you have already summed it up. So I really thank you so much. It's really hugely appreciated that you take the time to give us information that is maybe not easily accessible if you try to read documents and to have this overview. And this will also be shared on our website and with the members of the Gender Trade Coalition. So it will definitely, people will have an opportunity to listen to it later and go back to the links. So I think that will be also very valuable.
Very good. And I would also like to thank our translation team, interpreters being here, that have been made possible for everybody to use your original language without having to do it within the webinar. So thank you very much for this contribution. So yeah, do we close then? And thank you, Graciela, again, and thank you, Bettina, for being with us. And we hope to continue the discussion in the near future.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Gracias, gracias, Edna. Gracias, Gea.
Thank you, Gea. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Also, thanks to the interpreters. They helped me so much. It was great. Thank you. A pleasure seeing you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.